Welcome to Question Time. Tonight we are in Nottingham. On our panel, Robert Winston, a pioneer in the field of human fertility and Labour peer, perhaps best known as the presenter of television programmes such as Child in Our Time and The Human Body.
Against the backdrop of the report into the government's handling of the coronavirus released this week, why is it so difficult for politicians to say sorry?
Robert, as the scientist on the panel, do you want to kick us off?
Well, I agree, and they should. There's a lot to say sorry for. And I very much regret the kind of blame that is being put by some of the politicians on the scientists. It's interesting that they do this because sitting in the House of Lords, which I do, if you ever want to keep a secret, the thing to do is give a speech in the House of Lords. But every day of every week during COVID, we were tackling the health minister and we were not getting answers. And we raised all those issues really and squarely from masks and everything else. And I think the problem is that it is just very difficult to admit that so many people have died and they're still dying. And you know, it's also a virus that, of course, we as scientists did not know quite how to handle because it's very, very unusual virus. The incubation period is different. So, in fact, you're infectious when you're perfectly well, and it's not for some days later that you get ill, and that's not usual. And also, as we gradually learned during the pandemic, it was completely unlike SARS and MERS, I'm afraid to say, in spite of what what Jeremy Hunt says. The fact of the matter is that it's a totally different kind of virus which affects every organ in the body, including the brain, the gut, and actually has all sorts of different ways of appearing.
So when Jeremy Hunt said, Robert, that the government could have, and scientists could have looked at what was happening in countries like Taiwan, South Korea, in order to inform how we reacted here in this country. Do you think he has a point? Well,
no, because I think actually they're a very different population. They have very different genetics. They have a different resistance. They have different backgrounds to why the disease was prevalent. You've seen from our pandemic that there are certain people who are particularly likely to get the disease and get it very badly. And that was not the same in many other countries, for example, in Asia, who have exposure to different viruses. And the viruses that they had were not coronavirus beforehand. So we couldn't learn from them. We had to do our own thing. And if you look at it, to be fair, every single country in the world, including the Asian countries, didn't do very well. We all made mistakes. But we made catastrophic errors right from the very beginning. And what I find perhaps most disappointing is to see Jeremy Hunt, who was the Health Service Minister, the Secretary of State, who left the Health Service in such a shambolic state that we had no gowns for protection for patients, for the staff, and a whole range of massive issues which there's coming clearly in this report. And actually, he doesn't really show any kind of any remorse about it, and I think that's really rather shocking.
He did acknowledge that in fairness, he did acknowledge that he was part of the groupthink in terms of preparing for a flu-like a pandemic rather than the one we saw. So, Robert, briefly, you want to come back in?
Well,
so I want
very brief point. One of the things I have to say is that, you know, in spite of requests, the government never made the advice public, though we wanted the scientific advice public. And of course, in the House of Lords, there is another select committee, this Science and Technology Select Committee. Okay. We were looking at that virus every day of every week during the pandemic, and we were taking evidence from the scientists. Now, of course, it was confidential evidence, much of it, but actually it's not reflected in that report from the House of Commons. It was a very different view, because, of course, what we forget is that the House of Lords, you know, for all its faults, has a lot of expertise, particularly in science and particularly in these areas. And, of course, nobody really paid much attention to what we were saying. Okay. Coronavirus was first mentioned as a word in the House of Lords in January by Lord Patel, who was the chairman of the Science and Technology Select Committee.
And Robert?
I think we have to accept the fact that, you know, the history of our relationship with Ireland goes back a long way, where it's been really poisoned and where there have been moments when we could really achieve some amazing rapprochement, certainly when, in fact, after partition and with Northern Ireland. And I do think that actually, ultimately, if you sign a document like this, it's a contract, and actually you can't negate that afterwards. So it's all very well to say that you don't actually abide by what you've signed. I think you have to, and I think, unfortunately, one of the issues, of course, clearly, is our rejection of the role of the European Court of Justice, because it's not unreasonable that actually the EU would want to see that informed and in place. It probably doesn't actually much matter to the agreement, actually, because I don't suppose there will be a huge amount of legal issue.
I mean, there's plenty of people in Northern Ireland, obviously, who would take issue with that.
Yes. Yeah. But I think the basic principle of actually negating a treaty that you've made and you've signed is a very dangerous prospect. And I do agree that the risk of trust, you know, we're just seeing the trust just at the time when we're tangling with that massive problem in Afghanistan with people we've left behind, particularly the intelligence people, who are really now being recruited to the Taliban, and that shows that we can't do anything about it. And I think again and again we're going to find ourselves failing in world politics because we cannot be trusted. I think it's a real risk to Britain, and I think it's something we need to think about very clearly.
Can I just make one brief point?
Following the outrage around a professor at the University's views, how can a campus create a space of free speech while also protecting their diverse student body?
So this, what you're referring to, Grace, is there's a controversy surrounding Professor Kathleen Stock, I think is what you're talking about, who is at Sussex University, and she's been accused of people there of being transphobic, which she has vehemently denied. She has faced death threats. She's been advised by the police to install CCTV cameras outside her home and consider having bodyguards on campus. I mean, since you're... So, Robert, I'm interested in your view, given that you were Vice-Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam for some time.
I'm sorry?
I'm interested in your view, given that you were Vice-Chancellor of Sheffield Hallam, weren't you, for some time? I mean, this... You've mentioned Kathleen Stock, and that's a trans... issue, but obviously academic freedom has been talked about in a number of areas in recent years.
I was rather hoping that you'd be interested in my opinion as a biologist, which seems rather more important, because I'm going to say...
Well, I'm just saying it only because the issue of academic freedom isn't solely
I'm about to say something which will mean that you'll probably want to edit the programme when I finish, but basically...
Okay. Right. OK, we're all braced for it.
I will say this categorically, that you cannot change your sex. Your sex actually is there in every single cell in the body. You have a chromosomal sex, you have genetic sex, you have hormonal sex, you have all sorts of different kinds of psychological, brain sex, they're all different. And we are very confused about this, unfortunately, and regrettably it's got into this argument that people will now accuse me of being transphobic.
Well, obviously there are trans people who say you absolutely can do that.
Well, unfortunately, you can't say this publicly. This is one of the big problems. Even saying this on this programme undoubtedly will result in my getting a huge amount of hate mail. It always does. But I do think it's a big issue about the attitudes. There are, of course, issues which are important about young people who are confused about their sex, but we won't go down that route here. But it does affect a whole lot of issues in schools and elsewhere in our society. Of course, we should accept people as they are. Overall, I think it's a very sad thing that we can't discuss biological science without actually getting completely caught up emotionally with something which is really completely wrong.
Well, as I say, there are people who would vehemently disagree with you, so I'm just going to make that clear.